So today we're going to go over Jacob Appel's article, Wanted Dead or Alive, Kidney Transplants in Inmates Awaiting Execution. So in this article, Appel is going to argue that death row inmates should be allowed to be candidates for kidney transplants. Yes, the state has decided that they no longer have a right to live, but no, the state did not decide that it's okay to lower their quality of life while they wait to die. And furthermore, if it turns out that they are innocent, then we've caused them an irreversible harm. Also, life expectancy for death row is different. It's a different kind of measurement than life expectancy, natural life expectancy. And because of this, maybe it shouldn't be used in kidney allocation. Or if it is, maybe it should be considered in a different way. But kidney transplants are, overall less expensive than dialysis, so maybe this is better for everyone as a whole, even if it's going towards inmates. So back in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that inmates were entitled to the same medical care as free people. This makes sense. In 2002, California subsidized a $1 million heart transplant for a 31-year-old convicted robber in the fourth year of his 14-year sentence. In the same year, 2002, Minnesota provided a $900,000 life-saving bone marrow transplant to an incarcerated murderer with leukemia. And then in 2003, 47-year-old Horatio Alberto Reyes Camarena requested a kidney transplant while on death row in Oregon. So on the one hand, it would save money for everyone in the long run. Kidney transplants are about $80,000 to $100,000, and it's about $12,000 annually for the medication. In contrast, dialysis is about $120,000 per patient per year. So that number varies. I've seen anywhere from $70,000 to $120,000. But either way, dialysis is generally considered more expensive than a kidney transplant. On top of that, it's clear that getting a kidney transplant is in the best interest of the patient, in this case, Reyes Camarena. On the other hand, he's in prison. He's on death row. He's a convicted murderer. And there are, 97 other Americans waiting for their kidneys. There's roughly 200 in Oregon. So again, these numbers were 2002, so I think that number is even higher. There's close to 100,000 Americans waiting for kidneys, and I think only 20,000 transplants each year. So yeah, there's other people, free people, who also deserve to be considered for this. So this raises an interesting question, should death row inmates be eligible for kidney transplants? Initially you might think, no, of course not, they're death row inmates, but the ethical and practical reasons suggest that they definitely should be considered for candidates. So healthcare in the United States has generally been allocated based on who can pay, but the medical community really doesn't like that. They don't like the idea of letting economic factors affect the quality of a patient's care. So they had really bad negative experiences with this when they set up the God committees in the 1960s and 70s in the pre-Medicare era to decide who was going to get dialysis. People criticized these committees because they were using criteria such as social worth, education level, and potential future to determine how to allocate the kidneys. Others think that it's okay to include certain disease-induced behaviors, to exclude certain people from considerations. These are going to be, justifications for blanket exclusions of alcoholics from being considered for liver transplants. Nonetheless, the medical community agrees that, bad people are as equal as the rest of us, and they deserve equal medical care. So transplants on death row specifically kidney transplants, are going to challenge these principles in two ways. So first, the medical community is not the one making these decisions about social worth. It's the state. The state has already decided, and according to the state, this person's social worth is so low that they deserve to be executed. Secondly, unlike other organ transplants like the heart transplant or the bone marrow transplant, there are other non-transplant alternatives for the patient. So we could continue giving them dialysis. It's not as great, but it definitely has similar survival rates. Okay, so for a moment, let's set aside the ethics of capital punishment or whether a physician should really be around to even facilitate that practice. Really interesting question, but let's just assume that it's okay. Just because the state has decided to execute someone does not mean that the medical community, should be lowering their quality of life prior to their execution. Think about it like this, just because we've condemned them to die doesn't mean we can give them less food, right? We need to give them the same amount of food as everyone else. And so just like food, we need to be giving them the same amount of health care as everyone else. But yeah, so even though they've been condemned to die and they are condemned to be executed, they still, are worthy of equal medical care. Plus, the state's record on deciding guilt and innocence isn't so great. So we cite some 2002 numbers. So 75% of death sentences are overturned. So people are convicted or sentenced to death. Ultimately, they probably get, lifetime in jail as opposed to a death sentence. But then also people who are on death row, those people sometimes are then exonerated. So 1 out of 15 people on death row ultimately are exonerated of all charges. So I'm sure all of us have seen the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer by now, a few years ago. But the guy was convicted to life in jail. He might not, I don't think he was sentenced to death, but life in prison. And I think 15, 20 years ago it came out he was released, completely exonerated. DNA evidence proved that it definitely couldn't have been him. So yeah, there are definitely cases like this all the time. There are people on death row who are completely innocent. So if we were to deny people because they're on death row, then, we might, 1 out of 15 people could be a completely innocent person, and we can't undo that. We can't take this back. We've wronged this person in a way that's irreversible. On top of that, the state's determination of social worth is something that tends to fluctuate. So, maybe we shouldn't be using it to determine, our patient's standard of care. And, if we are going to only allow transplants for patients who are, obviously guilty, then, this is going to take the same, problem we were having before and putting the doctors back in the same awkward position of trying to determine social worth. It's just now one of the guise of obvious guilt. So there's another set of objections based on medical prognosis. Life expectancy has long been used in determining how to allocate kidneys amongst the free people. The idea is that you want to exclude someone who might not live as long as someone else. The idea is a death row inmate isn't going to live as long as a free person. The idea, we don't want to squander these kidneys. We want to be efficient with how we're using these scarce resources. But Appel is going to say that there's some false presumptions going on here in the background. According to 2002 numbers, the average life expectancy of someone on death row was about 13 years. And I guess the average life expectancy of someone who received a kidney transplant from a cadaver was about 13 years as well. This means that, half of death row inmates, so the half-life of someone with a kidney transplant was 13 years, which means, so half of all death row inmates who receive a kidney transplant are statistically likely to die of natural causes before they're actually executed. Which is going to suggest that, no, these organs are not going to be squandered. Or if they are, it's going to be relatively few and far between. So furthermore, there's a morally relevant difference going on here between natural life expectancy and probability of execution. So natural life expectancy has long been used by the medical community as a way of making these tough decisions without trying to bring in determinations of social value or social worth. In contrast, the probability of execution is going to undermine that reason in the first place altogether. So it's implicitly affirming the judgments of social worth of individuals. So the morally relevant difference here is that natural life expectancy and the probability of execution are going to be different. The former, using natural life expectancy, is used to avoid making judgments about social worth, while the latter is implicitly affirming these judgments of social worth. Okay, so people might not agree with this conclusion. They might not be very happy with it. I remember when I first learned about this, I explained the argument to my aunt, who was a nurse, and she was just not having it at all. So yeah, this is a conclusion that people are probably not likely to accept. But you know, maybe there's a silver lining here. Maybe there are reasons that they should be accepting it beyond, you know, these moral reasons. There seem to be practical reasons, like the state can save money. A kidney transplant is going to be less of a burden on society than keeping them on dialysis. And this is especially, I mean, think about, like, kidney transplants are just life enhancing. It's going to improve their quality of life. It's not actually going to extend it much longer than someone on dialysis. And again, these are 2002. So, you know, we're getting better with both dialysis and kidney transplants, but it definitely seems like kidney transplants are offering longer life expectancy than dialysis. But still, I mean, it's not like we're, you know, giving them a transplant and this is going to save their life forever. It's like it still only has so much help that it can possibly offer. So some would say that it's all right to sacrifice some public good. So it's okay that, you know, we're spending more money on dialysis rather than transplants if it means that convicted felons or convicted murderers aren't receiving this, you know, medical care, this scarce medical resource. These people seem like jerks and selfish, and it's like they're just not willing to consider it at all, and they'd rather squander this resource than share it with everyone. So yeah, this is Jacob Appel's argument that death row inmates should be considered as candidates for kidney transplants. Now, he's not saying that a death row inmate should get a kidney transplant over someone who doesn't have or isn't on death row. The idea is more that they should at least be considered be able to be added to the wait list of people waiting for kidney donations, as opposed to just blanket being excluded from them because of their current situation. So we should not be lowering the patient's standard of care. We should be considering them as equal and treating them as equal, treating them with the same medical care that we would treat a free person. All right, so think about this. Where do you guys draw the line? Would a person who is on death row, do you think they deserve medical care? Does it matter how bad their situation is, what they did, what crime they committed? Should these things affect someone's standard of care? Or is the medical community right? Bad people are as deserving of medical care as anyone else. So these are 2002 numbers, but the average life expectancy of someone on death row is around 13 years. And the half-life of people with transplants, the half-life of people who have gotten a transplant die within 13 years. The half-life of people who have gotten a transplant from people who've died of a cadaver transplant. Yep.